The dimly lit flickering gas lamps glowed into the darkened Victorian cobbled streets. The peaceful slumber of the twilight, interrupted by the sound of footsteps. Number 400, the woman thought, as she tossed a small paper package into the Thames River. Little did she know, this heinous act would be the last in a devilish career that spanned decades. Soon a discovery would be made, and it would be the body of a tiny little girl. This innocent infant would bring about the end of the dark and evil life of Amelia Dyer. Hi everybody and welcome back to the Dark Histories podcast. I hope everybody is well. I'm Rob, your host as always. A little bit of housekeeping before we start. Back after a little delay. I know it's been about a month since episode 5. Real life just sort of got in the way. But I've also taken a little time to try and improve the podcast. I've recently switched to Buzzsprout from Anchor, and I've gone back and listened to previous episodes to try to make the show better. One thing that I am going to try to do is to tell these in more of a story format, and I hope you enjoy them that way. I will go back to the Crusades in time, but not just yet. I feel like that episode didn't perform as well as I hoped, and maybe it was a little bit saturated. For this episode, please keep in mind that it could be distressing to some people. So without further ado, please sit back and relax next to the fire for more dark history. Bristol, like most British towns and cities at the time, was caught between the thick choking smog of the ever-growing juggernaut that was the Industrial Revolution and its somewhat backwater archaic past. Bristol itself had seen a boom during the 1800s, with roads and rail links, schools, police, post offices, and fire brigades improving the already booming shipbuilding industry and port. It was also burdened with the same problems as many industrial towns and cities of the time. Poor, swarming, dirt-ridden metropolises, drowning in smog and sewage, which impregnated the people with fears of epidemics of cholera, typhus and consumption. Squalid, sprawling slums, overpopulated with the destitute, poor and the unscrupulous among society. As you may have guessed, we start in Bristol, a city like many others in the year 1837. Isabard Kingdom Brunel, one of Bristol's famous sons, is pushing the envelope of his engineering brilliance with the launch of his Great Western steamship, which will go on to travel between Bristol and New York. The city was still reeling from the 1831 Queen Square riots that scuppered the completion of the Clifton Suspension Bridge, another of Brunel's engineering marvels. But for all of its booms and burdens, Bristol would form the backdrop of the birth of one Miss Amelia Elizabeth Dyer. A stone's throw away from the hustle and bustle of the cobbled streets of Bristol sits a quaint hamlet of Pile Marsh. Here, in 1837, a baby girl is brought into the world to parents Samuel Hobley, a master shoemaker, and his wife, Sarah Hobley, and they would name her Amelia Elizabeth Hobley. Amelia is the youngest of 5 in a well-respected family. Due to her father owning his own shoemaking shop, Amelia lived a life more fortunate than many in Victorian Britain. She was fed, clothed and educated. Her younger days are spent reading and writing, feeding her love for literature and poetry. You can almost imagine her sitting, engrossed, in the works of literary geniuses such as Dickens, Austen, and the Bronte sisters. Unfortunately, this idyllic vision would come to an end, as life would deal Amelia a fateful blow. Even this respectable family cannot escape the sinister clutches of the very infectious disease, typhus. This age-old contagion wrapped its icy death grip around her mother. Soon, her mother would be plagued with rashes, fever and headaches, developing into delirium, fits, and extreme mental instability. All this was witnessed by her carer and daughter, Amelia, who cared for her ailing mother until 1848, when she finally succumbed to this terrible disease. But the untimely passing of her mother was just another entry into the quickly developing tragic story that was Amelia's childhood. Firstly, in 1841, Amelia's eldest sister, Sally Ann, died at the age of 6, followed by the death of her younger sister, also called Sally Ann, in 1845, aged only a few months. By the time her father had perished in 1859, Amelia had left the family home to live with her aunt in Bristol, and by 1861, she had become permanently estranged from her family. Now aged 24, Amelia found herself living in a possibly cheap, dirty and overcrowded lodging house on Trinity Street in Bristol. Here she would meet and marry a man much older than herself, by the name of George Thomas. George was 59, and they both lied about their ages on the marriage certificate to reduce the age gap. George deducted 11 years from his age, and Amelia added 6 to hers. But this unorthodox marriage would spark a chain reaction that would ultimately cost the lives of hundreds of children. It was at this time, deep into her marital bliss with George, Amelia changed her studies from an apprentice corset maker to a nurse. Nursing was a somewhat grueling job in Victorian times, but was seen as a respectable occupation, and it enabled her to acquire useful skills. This change also brought a meeting with an equally despicable woman named Ellen Dane, a midwife who taught Amelia an easier way to make money through baby farming. Essentially, this Victorian practice consists of using one's home to provide lodging for young women who have conceived illegitimately, and then farming off the babies for adoption or allowing them to die of neglect or malnutrition. Arising this sort of practice grew from the 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act, which saw unmarried mothers struggle to gain an income due to the Act's removal of any financial obligation from the fathers of illegitimate children. Due to the social stigmata of being a single parent, people like Ellen and Amelia had no shortage of customs, as the only option for some mothers was starvation, the workhouse, or a baby farm. Shortly after their meeting, Dane was forced to flee to America to escape the attention of the police. Unfortunately, Dane's evil seed had been planted into Amelia's head, and she was going to use it. On the death of her husband George, in 1869, Amelia found herself in a predicament. She had become a single parent, with no job, as she had left the nursing profession to give birth to her daughter Ellen. With money running out, she turned to baby farming. With her newfound desire of making money, Amelia placed an advertisement in the local newspaper. For her expert service, she would nurse or adopt a baby in return for a substantial one-off upfront payment. She also listed that she was respectable, married, and that parents, or parent, would sleep soundly knowing that their baby was in a safe and loving home. As parents began to leave their babies with Amelia, she began to kill them. Rather than spend that payment on feeding and caring for the children, there was easier ways to pocket the money and get rid of the children. Initially, Dyer would let the children die from starvation and neglect. Mother's Friend, an opium-laced syrup, was given to quiet these children as they suffered through starvation. Eventually, Dyer resorted to faster murders, which allowed her to pocket even more profit. Amelia would add another layer of authenticity to her story by calling a coroner to confirm the death, claiming shock that the baby had died so soon, and feigning grief over their passing. Amelia's tricks and schemes would only work for so long. In the year 1879, an unnamed doctor became suspicious of the alarming numbers of infant deaths he had been called to certify in Dyer's care, and if they were indeed accidental. When the doctor informed the authorities of his findings, the police took Amelia into custody. It was there, inside of a wooden-panelled hallway of a courtroom, that she would be found guilty. Of what, I hear you cry? Surely it was murder. No. But if not murder, was it manslaughter? And again, no. Amelia Dyer was found guilty of neglect and sentenced to 6 months of hard labour. Might I add, this was incredibly lenient at the time, when you could be hanged for such notorious crimes as cutting down trees, being out at night with a blackened face, or the most heinous of crimes, wrecking a fish pond. Nevertheless, Amelia's time doing hard labour, as you might have guessed, consisted of physical work. Prisoners would be made to turn cranks or a heavy metal handle, or walk on a treadmill hundreds of times a day as punishment. Life inside the gallows was pretty much what you would expect: harsh, unsanitary, and downright deplorable. And it was the least that people like Amelia Dyer deserved. The experience did take a toll on her, though. It's alleged that it almost destroyed her mentally. But did the unfortunately lenient British penal system scare our faithful villain straight? No is the answer. It made her more cunning and devious. Upon her release, she placed more ads for more safe homes and continued collecting money for watching infants. On her second foray into baby farming, she learned from her mistakes. Possessed by her will for money and murder, she began to deposit the tiny bodies in different ways. Sometimes she wrapped them in cloth and buried them. Others, she dropped them into rivers, or brazenly, she would deposit them around town. This time, no doctor would meddle in her odious business. With her newfound cunning, she became astute in evading the law. Her previous experience of mental instability in the prison system, dovetailed with the first-hand knowledge of her mother's madness, gave her the tools for the perfect act. Add a newly formed addiction to alcohol and opium, and you have the methods of disappearing when police get close. Using all these skills, Amelia would disappear into the mental asylums with alleged breakdown, mental instabilities, and suicidal tendencies. Being a former asylum nurse, Amelia knew how to behave to ensure a relatively comfortable existence as an asylum inmate. In 1890, Dyer used this method to get herself out of a sticky situation. At the time, Dyer was caring for an illegitimate baby of a governess. When she returned to visit the child, the governess was immediately suspicious and stripped the baby to see if a birthmark was present on its hip. Of course, with Amelia's dark and twisted past, it wasn't. The governess alerted the authorities to a possibility of murder. As prolonged suspicion by the authorities grew, the ungodly Dyer feigned a breakdown, escaping into the asylum scot-free. Dyer at one point used her darkly innovative mind to evade capture by drinking 2 bottles of laudanum in a serious suicide attempt, but her long-time abuse had built up her tolerances to opium products, so yet again she escaped the grasp of the law and the clutches of death. Amelia Dyer's terror streak wasn't just confined to Bristol. She travelled around the country charging between £10 and £80, the equivalent to about £1,000 and £8,000 today, for her services. The adverts were placed in newspapers in Reading and Plymouth, and even as far afield as Liverpool. It would be Amelia's move to Reading that would culminate in the end of her sinister practices. She arrived in the summer of 1895 with her daughter Mary Ann and son-in-law Arthur Ernest Palmer, settling into the suburb of Caversham, north of the town centre, just across the River Thames. Just as she had done for the previous 30 years, she placed an advertisement in the local newspaper for her services. She would relocate to Kensington Road in Reading that very same year, but her trade continued. In January 1896, Evelyn Merman, a popular 25-year-old barmaid, gave birth to an illegitimate daughter, Doris, in a boarding house in Cheltenham. She quickly sought offers of adoption and placed an advertisement in the miscellaneous section of the Bristol Times and Mirror newspaper. It simply read, "Wanted, respectable woman to take young child." Merman intended to go back to work and hoped to eventually reclaim her infant. In a quite unfortunate twist of fate, Merman saw an advertisement next to her own reading, "Married couple with no family would adopt healthy child. Nice country home. Terms £10. You can only imagine what Evelyn Merman was thinking as she perused through the unsuspecting notice. Merman hastily responded to the ad, and she wouldn't wait long for a reply. Addressed from a Mrs. Harding of Oxford Road, Reading, the letter read, "I should be glad to have a dear little girl, one I could bring up and call my own. We are plain, homely people, in fairly good circumstances. I don't want a child for money's sake, but for companion and home comfort. Myself and my husband are dearly fond of children. I have no children of my own. A child with me will have a good home and a mother's love." Unknown to Merman, Mrs. Harding was none other than Amelia Dyer. Evelyn Merman wanted to pay more affordable weekly fees for a care of her daughter, but Mrs. Harding insisted on giving her one-off payment in advance. But Merman was in desperate straits, so she reluctantly agreed to pay the £10, and a week later, Mrs. Harding arrived in Cheltenham. Merman was apparently surprised by Dyer's advanced age and stocky appearance, but Dyer seemed affectionate towards Doris. Evelyn handed over her daughter and a cardboard box of clothes and the £10. Still distressed to have given up care of her daughter, Evelyn accompanied Dyer to Cheltenham Station and then on to Gloucester. She returned to her lodging, a broken woman. A few days later, she received a letter from Mrs. Harding, saying all was well. Merman wrote back, but she never received a reply. Dyer did not travel to Reading as she told Merman. She went instead to 74 Mayo Road, Wellsden, London, where her 23-year-old daughter Polly was staying. There, Dyer quickly found some white edging tape used in dressmaking, wound it twice around the baby's neck, and tied it in a knot. Death would not have been immediate, and unfortunately, it's likely the child suffered. Both women allegedly helped to wrap the body in a napkin. They kept some of the clothes Merman packed, and the rest were destined for a pawnbroker. Dyer paid the rent to the unwitting landlady and gave a pair of child's boots as a present for her little girl. The following day, Wednesday the 1st of April, 1896, another child, named Harry Simmons, was taken to Mayo Road. However, with no spare white edging tape available. The length around Doris's corpse was removed and used to strangle a 13-month-old boy. On April the 2nd, both bodies were stacked into a carpet bag, along with bricks for added weight. Dyer then headed for Reading. At a secluded spot she knew well near the weir at Caversham Lock, she forced the carpet bag through the railings, into the River Thames. Unknown to Dyer, on the 30th of March 1896, a package was received from the Thames at Reading by a bargeman. It contained the body of a baby girl, later identified as Helena Fry. In the small detective force available to Reading Borough Police, headed by Chief Constable George Chewsley, and Detective Constable Anderson, made a crucial breakthrough. As well as finding a label from Temple Mead Station, Bristol, he used microscopic analysis of the wrapping paper and deciphered a faintly legible name, Mrs. Thomas, and an address. This evidence was enough to lead police to Dyer, but they still had no strong evidence to connect her directly to the serious crimes. Initial evidence they gained from witnesses and information obtained from Bristol police only served to increase their concerns, and DC Anderson, with Sergeant James, placed Dyer's home under surveillance. Subsequent intelligence suggested that Dyer would abscond if she became at all suspicious. The officers decided to use a young woman as a decoy, hoping she would be able to secure a meeting with Dyer to discuss her services. This may have been designed to help the detectives positively link Dyer to her business activities, or it may have simply given them a reliable opportunity to arrest her. It transpired that Dyer was expecting her new client to call, but instead she found detectives waiting on her doorstep. On the 3rd of April, police raided her home. They were apparently struck by the stench of human decomposition, although no human remains were found. There was, however, plenty of other relatable evidence, including white edging tape, telegrams regarding adoption arrangements, pawn tickets of children's clothing, receipts for advertisements, and letters from mothers inquiring about the well-being of their children. The police calculated that in the previous few months alone, at least 20 children had been placed in the care of a Mrs. Thomas, now revealed to be Amelia Dyer. It also appeared that she was about to move home again, this time to Somerset. This rate of murder has led some estimates that Mrs. Dyer may, over the course of decades, have killed over 400 babies and children, making her one of the most prolific murderers ever, as well as the most prolific murderess ever. Helena Fry, the baby removed from the River Thames on March the 30th, had been handed over to Dyer at Temple Mead Station on the 5th of March. That same evening, she arrived home carrying only a brown paper parcel. She hid the package in the house, but after 3 weeks, the odour of the decomposition prompted her to dump the dead baby into the river. As it was not weighted adequately, it had been easily spotted. Amelia Dyer was arrested on April 4th and charged with murder. Her son-in-law, Arthur Palmer, was charged as an accessory. During April, the Thames was dredged and 6 more bodies were discovered, including Doris Merman and Harry Simmons, Dyer's last victims. Each baby had been strangled with white tape, which, as she later told the police, was how you could tell it was one of mine. 11 days after handing her daughter to Dyer, Evelyn Merman, whose name had emerged in items kept by Dyer, identified her daughter's remains. On the 22nd of May, 1896, Amelia Dyer appeared at the Old Bailey and pleaded guilty to one murder, that of Doris Merman. Her family associates testified at her trial that they had been growing suspicious and uneasy about their activities, and it emerged that Dyer had narrowly escaped discovery on several occasions. Evidence from a man who had seen and spoken to Dyer when she disposed of 2 bodies at Caversham Locks also proved significant. Her daughter had given graphic evidence to ensure Amelia Dyer's convictions. The only defence Dyer offered was insanity. She had been twice committed to asylums in Bristol. However, the prosecution argued successfully that her exhibitions of mental instability had been applied to avoid suspicion. Both committals were said to coincide with times when Dyer was concerned her crimes might have been exposed. It took the jury only 4.5 minutes to find her guilty. In her 3 weeks in the condemned cell, she filled 5 exercise books with her last true and only confession. Visited the night before her execution by a chaplain, she asked if she had anything to confess. She offered him her exercise books, saying, "Isn't this enough?" Curiously, she was to appear as a witness in Polly's trial for murder, set for a week after her own execution date. However, it was ruled that Amelia was already legally dead once sentenced, and that therefore her evidence would be admissible. Thus her execution was not delayed. On the eve of her execution, Amelia heard that the charges against Polly had been dropped. On Wednesday the 10th of June, 1896, at precisely 9 a.m, Amelia Elizabeth Dyer was hanged until dead by James Billington at Newgate Prison, a fitting end to one of history's vilest women. Thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to listen to this quite hard episode. Anything that involves the neglect or mistreatment of children really does get to me. Dyer was such an evil woman. 400 different children, taken so young. How could you even live with yourself? And to think it was all for money. Relatively speaking, this wasn't that long ago, and the mind boggles to think that just over 100 years ago, it was common practice. The Victorian times are so close to us in a time sense, yet a million miles away in a social sense. Anyway, if you liked the episode, please drop us a review. It helps the podcast out. If you think friends and family may like this, then share it with them. Links to TikTok and YouTube, Insta, and the show email and Twitter are below. I've also created a Discord and a Facebook page. These are to make it easier to contact me. I can't reply to reviews, nor can I read reviews that aren't from my country of origin, so it would be nice to interact with my listeners, and I also look forward to hearing from you. As always, if you've been listening for a while and not subscribed, please do it. In that way you never miss an episode. So with all that out the way, please join me for episode 7 and more dark history.